So my passion is to help people get their voices heard in a way that improves the health service. And I'm a digital storyteller. So I started a big project in Swansea Bay Health Board, recording good and bad experiences with patients, their families, staff, anybody who had something to say which would impact policy and services for the better. So I've got 2 stories to share with you tonight. And as Emily said, I was a midwife, which means that when it comes to stories about birth, I find it really hard to make them short. So my aim is always 2 minutes. So apologies to the storytellers who told these stories, because I've had to cut them down slightly to fit them into the time slot that I've been given. So they are slightly shortened versions, these.
I was in the birthing pool. My husband was there. It was very quiet and my waters broke. He found out that Bram started to get into a bit of distress, so he's taken up to the labour ward to give birth. It was quite scary. They found out that they had to do an emergency forceps delivery, so I tore quite badly. After he was born, I was taken straight to theatre to be stitched up. My husband was left on his own with the baby. He was too scared to text any of the parents to say that Bram was born because he didn't know if I was going to be okay. We went home. It was a bit stressful with the baby for the first couple of days. We had the midwives visiting all the time, and I also started suffering from panic attacks, which I didn't recognise as panic attacks, even though I'd suffered from them in the past. I thought, oh, this is just the baby blues, I'm fine, I'll be okay. Then the next couple of days I just got more and more anxious and sleeping less and less, and I started having really bad dreams and nightmares to do with the experience, death and things like that, and getting very confused between what was reality and what wasn't. And I started to become more and more concerned about whether I was suffering from postnatal psychosis. So on the Saturday, my husband took me to Morriston in a dreadful state. She was very concerned and sent me to Kevin Coyd on the Saturday night. That was a very frightening experience because I was very worried about whether Bram would be taken off me. Kevin Coyd has sent me home because I wanted to carry on breastfeeding. On the Sunday, I spoke to my husband and I said, I can't do this anymore. I told him that he would have to make the decisions about what was going to happen to me and to tell my story to the medical professional we'd be going to see. So he took me back to the out-of-hours hospital in Morriston, and she spent about half an hour ringing around asking if I'd back into Singleton. And eventually then I was readmitted, and it took them a long time. I was prescribed some tranquilizers and some sleeping drugs to help me sleep, and then I slept that night. It's taken me a little while to get better. I've had a bit of counselling and I'm much better now. Other people could find it really hard and not be able to recover in the way that I have. I want to do something about the lack of services in the area.
So Hannah told her story because she wanted to improve services, and she did. And over the last 5 years, there's been a new service introduced in the Swansea area called the Perinatal Response and Management Service, better known as PRAMS, much nicer title. And the author of the next story is Toni, and she has benefited from this service.
Once I'd given birth to the baby, they started me on medication straight away. It was too late. I found myself just walking around in a state. I didn't know what I was doing or where I was going. I was just walking round and round, and I remember a lorry driving past, and in that split second I just wanted to jump in front of it. So I got home and I could see my husband was really worried, and he called the crisis team, and I said that I would only speak to the crisis team if my midwife was with me. Late at night, she comes straight to my house, and then I went into wall death. So I was in wall death for 3 days. I didn't eat, I didn't drink, I didn't do anything. I was just in the same clothes. I was just having a meeting, asking how long I'd be there for. I was separated from the baby, which was a concern because my bond with her was already at a risk because I thought she was better off without me. So I wasn't bonding with her for those first couple of weeks because I didn't want to be here. And then my midwife come to see me again. She made sure I got in the shower and got changed, and then Pram's come along then. I went into a mother and baby unit in Derby. I was there for 7 weeks. So Anita from Pram's come to see me, which was a huge comfort. It wasn't just doctors and nurses there, it was someone from home. I was there for 7 weeks, and that's when Pram's really become involved in and helped support me. So they supported the discharge. They would come out to see me weekly. I would have appointments with their doctors about the medication. Always had telephone contact, email contact. I knew that they was always there. And they really continued to support me for the rest of the journey. I then suffered with postpartum psychosis when the baby was around 6 months. So I ended up back in hospital in wall death. And Anita from Prams would come out and see me once or twice a week, which again was so comforting because, again, I didn't have the baby with me. There was no mother and baby units with any available beds. I was stuck in wall death without my children. And then they just continued to support me until recently when I was discharged.
In 2015, Hannah told her story and the Pram service was set up. In 2019, Toni benefited from the Pram service, and now her story has helped to bring a new mother and baby unit to Wales. We didn't have one anywhere in Wales before this, and it's in the process of being built just outside Swansea in Toni. So in conclusion, policy is essentially about how resources are going to be distributed. And by telling our stories, we can influence that distribution, just as Hannah and Toni have demonstrated by telling their stories. Thank you.
The United States has the highest maternal mortality rate of all developed countries, even though we spend more money on maternal health care than any other nation does. Black women are 4 times more likely to die during childbirth than white women are. I created an installation and performance piece called Mother's Right, which is about the United States' high maternal mortality rate. It's also about postpartum post-traumatic stress disorder. With the help of midwives and doulas and some interns, we sewed 1,200 hospital gowns, one for every woman who died during childbirth in the United States in 2013. I have a little clip of the first performance that we did of Mother's Right. The performance aspect of this piece involved pairs of women facing each other, folding the gowns into a triangle, appropriating the flag folding ceremony that is used at the funeral for a fallen soldier. Appropriating this sacred ceremony was understandably controversial, and the reason I did this is because more people need to know that women are coming out of childbirth with the same psychological symptoms affecting people who fight wars. I have a newer version of the Mother's Right performance that was supposed to take place in June at the AWON conference. AWON is the Association of Women's Health, Obstetric, and Neonatal Nurses. And for this performance, I was going to change it up a bit. I was going to iron on patches onto the gowns that represent the number of Black women who died during childbirth in relation to the number of white women. But it was canceled due to COVID. But I hope that this piece can get seen soon. And The next piece I'm going to discuss is called Kimberly Said No. It's a performance that is based off the real-life experience of a very brave woman named Kimberly Turbin, who was assaulted by her doctor while she was giving birth to her first baby. Kimberly was begging her doctor not to do an episiotomy, and he did it anyway, and even though neither she nor her baby were in any danger at all. He cut her 13 different times and mutilated her, and it was all caught on film. So for the performance, I had actors sit in chairs and read the transcript from the video word for word. I chose this pared down performance because I didn't want anything to distract from those words and from her story. This is Kimberly. She flew in for the performance, and having her there was really special because she went through so much. She had a really hard time holding her doctor accountable for what he did to her because the laws in the US are not on the side of women when it comes to giving birth. And I think seeing her story shared in this way was cathartic for her. I like to partner with nonprofits for these performances to help amplify our shared messages. So I had Dawn Thompson from Improving Birth speak. She helped Kimberly find a lawyer, and she gave Kimberly a ton of support throughout this whole ordeal. And Dawn and her organization have been doing amazing work fighting for birth justice. This is a copy of one of the scripts that I made and produced in Editions. Whenever I do a performance, I like to also have a small physical piece of art that goes with the piece, and I feel like this is another way to keep Kimberly's story alive so that more people can learn from her experience. The last performance I'll touch on briefly is a show that I curated called Motherload, which is a multidisciplinary show featuring artists, musicians, poets, and dancers. We're making work about pregnancy, birth, postpartum, and motherhood. We had so many amazing artists share their stories about infertility, postpartum sex, the invisible load, and the difficulties artists who are also mothers face. We had one musician write a song about the fertility timeline that looms over women, which men do not have to worry about. And we had another amazing songwriter who wrote a piece about her painful experience with postpartum depression. We also had an incredible dancer perform a piece about being a stay-at-home mom. And then Kimberly Said No was also performed again at this event. There's a Thomas Hardy quote that a friend recently shared with me that really hit me hard, and it made me think of why I started using performance in my practice. The quote is from Far From the Madding Crowd, and the female character says, "It is difficult for a woman to define her feelings in a language which is chiefly made by men to express theirs." It made me think about how, as an artist, sometimes we need to find different ways of expressing ourselves because the mediums that we normally use might not be sufficient. When the majority of the population talks about the great artists, they talk about, for the most part, white male painters and sculptors. And while women have certainly made painting and sculpting our own, women were for the most part left out of many conversations in art history. But performance art is a young art form. It was born in the 1970s during the second wave of the feminist movement, and women were actually a part of the birth of the performance movement. It wasn't an art form that we had to redefine for ourselves as women, which is why it's so useful to explore issues with maternal health. It's not saturated in a history that's dominated by men. Pregnancy, birth, breastfeeding, and mothering are all very physically demanding, and performance art uses the body in a way that visual art does not, which also makes it the perfect medium for art about maternal health. Artists create culture, and in order to make social change, you need to change culture first. which is why artwork about maternal health issues is so important. This is how we're going to get the rest of the population to see that we have a broken system and that women are paying with their lives. Thank you.
Hello everyone. So my performance work has explored the maternal, drawing on my personal experience of motherhood. I have also examined the idealizing of motherhood in an Irish context, including the systematic state-sanctioned policing of and exploitation of maternal bodies. Between 2013 and 2018, I also worked with Speaking of Imelda, a direct action feminist performance group that advocated for abortion access on the island of Ireland. On the 25th of May 2018, the electorate in the Republic of Ireland voted to repeal the 1983 Eighth Amendment to the Irish Constitution, which prevented access to abortion in almost all circumstances by granting the fetus equal rights to life as the pregnant person. The Eighth Amendment also restricted autonomy in pregnancy. Following the referendum, abortion on request up to 12 weeks of pregnancy was legalised in the Republic of Ireland. In 2019, abortion in Northern Ireland was also decriminalised. Despite being part of the UK, unlike England, Scotland and Wales, Northern Ireland was exempt from the 1967 Abortion Act. These recent hard-fought gains were the result of the tireless efforts of pro-choice activists operating across various fields and in a diversity of different ways over decades. In our own small way, Speaking of Imelda contributed a diasporic voice to the recent campaigns by utilising performance and intervention to advocate for access to abortion. The collective was founded in late 2013 by Tressa O'Brien and myself, two Irish artists living in London. To initiate the group, we sought out intergenerational input, contacting Anne Rossiter and setting up a public meeting with her in December 2013. Rossiter is a lifelong reproductive rights activist and author of Ireland's Hidden Diaspora, The Abortion Trail and the Making of a London Irish Underground. This book charts the history of Irish Women's Abortion Support Group, a group of activists in London that aided those travelling from the island of Ireland for abortion between 1980 and 2000. In our use of red clothing within our public appearances, the Imeldas reference the work of Irish Women's Abortion Support Group, who sometimes wore a red skirt when going to meet abortion seekers at airports and stations so as to be identifiable. Irish Women's Abortion Support Group also used the girl's name Imelda as a code word for abortion, and our title referenced this. We, however, transformed Imelda into an acronym, Ireland Making England the Legal Destination for Abortion. Involving numerous members from different walks of life, over 5 years the Imeldas carried out a number of performative interventions to unapologetically advocate for reproductive choice, often turning up unexpectedly at London Irish events alongside making surprise appearances on the island of Ireland. In 2014, we turned up at the advice surgery of Jeremy Hunt, the Secretary of State for Health, which took place in a Sainsbury's supermarket in Farnham. We presented him with half-eaten apples to which we had attached advice on making it possible for Northern Irish women to access abortion. Taoiseach Enda Kenny also had a surprise encounter with the Imeldas when we landed a pair of Repeal the 8 knickers on his dinner table at a London fundraising event for his political party as part of our Knickers for Choice campaign. The Imeldas unapologetically advocated for reproductive autonomy. Of course, ensuring the right to autonomy in reproductive decision-making and pregnancy remains a pressing question for maternal health and policy. So I'd like to offer some observations around how performance enables an exploration of such. Performance places the body center stage in the fight for bodily autonomy and reproductive choice. Performance resists the erasure of the pregnant person as a physical, sentient being in reproductive healthcare policy. Performance ruptures the silences surrounding abortion and reproductive healthcare. Performance relates the everyday realities of maternal labour alongside the multiple and diverse circumstances that impact on reproductive decision-making. Performance makes the impact of healthcare policy on maternal bodies visible. Performance makes complex legal language accessible and relatable to everyday realities. Performance challenges patriarchal systems of control and undermines the authority of those that seek to exploit maternal bodies. Performance challenges the idealizing of motherhood and patriarchal constructions of femininity. Performance is a vehicle for bringing people together, mobilizing collective responses, and demonstrating solidarity across borders. Performance enables us to reclaim and intervene in public space. Performance enables us to be cheeky, brave, unapologetic in advocating for our rights and directly confronting those in positions of power. Performance amplifies our voices, demonstrating to those that deride us all as shrill that we will not be silent. Thank you.
So yeah, my presentation today is thinking about maternal well-being, but within the frame of storytelling practices. My presentation draws really heavily on two people's stories that I will share with you, obviously with their full consent. I work in Cwmtaf Morgannwg Health Board. I used to work with Prue over in Swansea, and one of the stories I actually made with Prue, which is lovely. But yeah, my main job is I work as a family therapist. So I often work with parents and families who are impacted by mental ill health. But I also run storytelling groups, predominantly with women. And I've just finished a project called Not to Be Forgotten Stories, which was a way for people to share their all the kind of massive range of stories that have come out from the pandemic. So it's a real passion of mine. Just to kind of offer some kind of framework for the presentation this evening, the question that we were posed as panelists was, what are the pressing questions for maternal health and policy? And somewhat awkwardly, maybe rebelliously, I've kind of answered that question with a question. And my question is, how are we listening? And how are we being good companions to people's stories? And I mean stories in a kind of broadest sense. So the how are we respect people's lives? So, and also, how do we move away from an individualised model of care that we have in our health service to one where we can start to think family and think beyond family, think more systemically? And how might performance help us to do that? So I have actually answered that question, and I've answered that question by saying performance enlivens and moves us to action. We are not passive listeners to our own stories or to other people's stories. We are moved to be in relationship with a storyteller, and we are moved to be good companions to, I've borrowed that phrase, by the way, good companions, by Rosa Snyder, 28, should reference them. And we can also be good companions, and we can help populate people's stories with multiple characters. I'm also a big fan of Soini Madison, and one of her quotes is that my body in live performance is the truth that I exist and have existed with you, with myself, in the abundance of this present moment. Performance invites us to bear witness as a form of truth. So with that, I'm going to share, hopefully fingers crossed that this works, I'm going to share with you a story. This is Laura's story.
When you first find out you're pregnant, it's not nice to burst out into tears. But I had believed that I can get through this, and I had the friends and support, and I was living a time of my life. Broke up then with my second partner, and I moved to a town called Peacehaven after being homeless and living with friends. I was heavily pregnant, and then suddenly moved to a flat on my own, where my space didn't have lots of the financial stresses and the day-to-day stresses, to where I just had breakdowns after breakdowns of being on my own and not being able to love my child as much as I'd like to love my child. I had a good bond, and my daughter was 6 months old until where I just had too many other breakdowns and called for help. And that's the part where it hits you, is when you call for help. And they say that's the strongest thing that you can do, and I believe them. You're that low. I got the help then from a mother baby clinic in Eastbourne. People could help me so I could help my child. It was hard work and still struggles whilst you're in the mother baby clinic, but you're there with other mothers and a good staff that know what you're going through. Now I've been diagnosed with bipolar and on medication and with the right support. I feel that my second time of pregnancy has gone more smoother and a much more brighter future.
So that was Laura's story. And Laura shared her story because she wanted people to understand how important it is at any stage of life, but particularly when you're feeling really vulnerable, having had a child and having complications in terms of mental health, how important it is to build trust in relationships with others in order to be able to receive care and support. But we know that there's a lot of fear around that, and the worry that parents have around, particularly mothers, have around their babies being removed from their care if they talk about their mental health, if they share their experiences, can often prevent people from coming into services. So some of the services that we know are really helpful, like parent support groups, etc., are not always accessed because of that fear factor. Whereas a project like the one that we run, which is around kind of storytelling and sharing, doesn't necessarily have that kind of fear factor built in. So so basically what I kind of wanted to highlight that is that idea around relationships and how, if you like, the kind of storytelling is part of that kind of relationship building and that relationship development. Mental ill health impacts all relational aspects of family life, but more often than not, it's an individualized approach. So it's often intervention is targeted at the person who has the diagnosis. Group work, particularly group work that is kind of creatively framed, offers a kind of destigmatizing alternative to that, which can be profoundly transformative. And I'm just going to read you this quote, and then we're going to listen to another story. This quote is from narrative therapist David Denborough. Stories about our lives start before our birth, and they don't end with our death. We carry on the legacies, gifts, and burdens of those who have come before us, and those with whom we are connected will carry on our legacies long after we have gone.
It's been 8 years. It's been 15 years. It's been 30 years. It's been 42 years. Growing up, I heard this phrase countless times. It was the phrase my mother would use to exclaim at the length of time she had been tormented, persecuted and lied about. But it would also always correspond with my age at that time. It created a kind of dissonance between the belief that my arrival had been a blessing, that I was very much loved and wanted, contrasting with the simmering darkness of my mother's episodes of psychosis. It never caused me guilt. I had not asked to be born and was not responsible for the postpartum psychosis that happened 10 days after I was born. My existence had no bearing on how my mother would go on to develop schizophrenia. Later, as an adult, I concluded that this dissonance had evoked the feeling of being unworthy. My birth had come at a punitive price. My mother had sacrificed her sanity to give me life. But this story takes an unexpected turn. Having heard that phrase countless times and internalizing the connection between my birth and her suffering, my mother had a message for me as she lay dying. She said, "I wasn't okay before you were born. I needed my daughter. I needed you." In those 14 words, my mother gave me a final and precious gift. She released me from my own self-torment. She felt I'd been worth that awful price. That strong maternal instinct had never faded. She knew what a child needed to hear in order to heal. I was still her little girl.
So I'm just going to conclude with a quote from, this is another person who's from one of the groups that I'm a part of, and this was in the paper that was published last year that that Emily mentioned. This is Gemma Newkirk. She says, "It's absolutely necessary when healing from anything to feel seen, to feel heard. Storytelling is inevitably connected to both health and caring."
It's interesting. I'm just going to say this very briefly. We're creating connections with the past and things that we have already done, but also there's an opportunity for this presentation to present things for the future, things that happen, our plans for the future, things that haven't happened yet. We're probably going to answer the questions of the provocation with questions, so we don't have acceptances yet. And we're definitely shifting our attention from stories said to also stories that are very non-verbal and body-based. So that's, something to bear in mind. As mentioned, I'm the director of Research Center for Arts and Wellbeing. I will refer to the Arts for the Blues project because that is happening, has happened, and will continue happening. I'm presenting on behalf of the Arts for the Blues team, but we have a large team that are, some of whom are present here today. The founders of the Arts for the Blues teams, Joanna, Willis Thurston, and Scott Thurston. But the team is much larger, and we're very fortunate to have Emma joining us last year as a PhD student. Emma, should I pass things to you?
Yes. So as Vicky said, I am taking my PhD at Edge Hill University, and Vicky is my Director of Studies, and my other supervisors there are Lena and Dr. Mark Edward as well. And I'm going to talk a little bit about my PhD project, which it fits into Vicky's work of the Arts and Wellbeing Research Centre and the Arts for the Blues project as well. So I will talk a bit about my project, and then Vicky will give a bit more of an overview about the Arts for the Blues and how it fits in together a little bit later. So as I said, I'm undertaking my PhD at Edge Hill. I'm also a dance movement psychotherapist as well. This is my project, The Body in Perinatal Health. It's a study that I'm designing, and it's looking at ways in which dance movement psychotherapy, which is an artistic and embodied psychological intervention, might be helpful for mothers who are suffering with postnatal depression. So according to NICE, postnatal depression affects between 15 to 20% of mothers, and my guess is that that number is currently much higher due to COVID, because two of the known risk factors for postnatal depression are isolation and lack of support structures. And as I say, the project is linked with the Arts for the Blues project, and it will broaden that project into perinatal mental health services. So when I began designing the Body and Perinatal Health project, I was really clear that there would be an artistic element in the research, because arts-based research can cross boundaries, as has been evidenced by the Arts for the Blues, and also by a project that I came across at the University of Derby, the Birth Project. And both of these projects have used artistic practice methods to impact on clinical practice. And I think Susan Stinson was on the mark when she said, if you can't draw it or make a three-dimensional model of it or dance it, you probably don't understand it. So how can performance address the pressing questions of maternal health? Well, there are many historical ideas that feed into representations of the archetypal mother. And in my early research, one thing I've come across repeatedly is the idea of maternal instinct, which I find really fascinating as a psychotherapeutic background that I have. And research has shown time and again that there isn't really any such thing as maternal instinct. It's not a natural development that happens necessarily. In fact, one key clinician, a psychoanalyst, Bruno Bettelheim, who worked in the mid-20th century, acknowledged that maternal instinct doesn't exist, and yet he actually refused to endorse this finding within academia, because he argued that the guilt that arises in a mother when a maternal instinct is not felt acts as a protective factor against rejection of the child. So put simply, he was saying that the mother's guilt protects the child from psychological harm, and therefore it's worth preserving. And we now know that there are key things that need to happen in order for an attachment to be formed between a child and a caregiver. And we also know that this doesn't have to be the mother. Studies have shown levels of attachment to be equal across groups of mothers and fathers, and also adoptive parents, including a parenting unit that does not include a mother. And yet, mainstream artistic output continues to supply evidence for the myth of the maternal instinct. And as Rebecca Feasey claims, the good mother dominates the media marketplace with few alternatives to this maternal depiction. And in this context, she's defining the good mother as one who devotes herself entirely to childbearing out of a pure desire to do nothing other than this. And I would go further to argue that the few alternatives that she does acknowledge are mostly seen as subversive, as less than the ideal mother. So I think that the question of representation is at the heart of this issue, and this then addresses questions of intersectionality, because of course all cultural groups have their own version of the ideal mother. And we need to be constantly asking, how can mothers be better represented? We need to listen to women without prejudice, and to disseminate and present their experiences throughout all artistic endeavour. So this is a bit more about my project. So these are the overall research questions, which are looking at how the intervention of dance movement psychotherapy might support mothers, and is specifically asking what mothers' perceptions and experiences and relationship with themselves and with their babies are before, during and after the intervention. It's not aiming to record outcome measures reported by the mothers, but it's a qualitative study that aims to highlight the individual experiences of mothers within the intervention. So why dance movement psychotherapy? Well, the act of pregnancy, childbirth and early parenthood generates huge changes in the body, both physically and emotionally. It's a transitional period in which the body is at the core. And so it may be assumed that dance movement psychotherapy as an embodied practice is an ideal intervention to address these changes that are felt at a bodily level. The voices of the mothers are to be placed at the forefront of the research and seeking to highlight their experiences and their perceptions. And the general discourse in this sector is beginning to accept the need for maternal services to prioritise the experiences of women over medical intervention where possible. There's relatively little research concerning arts therapy's intervention with postnatal depression. So the aim of my study is to understand the experiences of the participants, which will hopefully go on to inform further research with the intervention. So there'll be 12 sessions of group dance movement psychotherapy delivered to mothers with their babies. The mothers will be interviewed and will be given the opportunity to engage in those interviews in an embodied way. And all arts-based data will be considered as research data and will go on to inform artistic dissemination and presentation of the findings. And this will hopefully open up the range of platforms that are available to present the data. And by data, I mean the mother's experiences. Vicky.
Yes, I'm going to take us a bit step back just to give a bit of a background information regarding the Arts for the Blues, which is the blueprint, the starting point for Emma's project in terms of the intervention and what will happen within these 12 sessions. I think some of the ideas from the Arts for the Blues are relevant also in terms of policy, and definitely health started as a project that had to do with addressing issues around depression, not specifically and exclusively depression experienced by women, and certainly not perinatal depression, but it started, interestingly enough, from a Cochrane review. Cochrane review is a sort of synthesis of studies that is regarded very highly. It was a dance movement psychotherapy for depression review that we're hoping that will inform, and Cochrane reviews normally do that, inform practice, inform policy, inform services. We brought these different types of evidence together. However, the accessibility of these reviews are questionable. So the original idea was to make this type of review more accessible to the general public. And we did a sort of fairly brave attempt to turn quantitative study to a performance. So I'm going to, so Dancing the Blues was the original piece of work that turned a Cochrane review into performance, a multidisciplinary performance that involved a poet, choreographer, dancer, and musician. We gave the three artists 4 concepts that came from the Cochrane review on the contribution, the potential contribution dance movement psychotherapy can make to depression, and in particular concepts around vitality, relationships, symbolism, and narratives. And they created this interdisciplinary piece. It's a piece very open to interpretation. It can be read as about experience of depression as well as the experience of therapy, and sort of it can represent references to life. There is a link here. It's also accessible under the Arts for the Blues website if you want to see this piece. However, we needed to take some of these experimentations also into back to practice. We felt that it was important what was happening in the studio. We also needed to bring our own experience as art psychotherapists, and are working with other therapists in that experience, and develop a protocol that would be appropriate for people with depression. We did workshops with patients and staff in hospitals and the NHS, in particular in improving access to psychological treatment services in Manchester, where Joanna is based. And we did an extensive literature review, thematic synthesis of 72 papers. So there's a lot of work that has gone behind the Art for the Blues project that resulted in the model, the Art for the Blues model. The Art for the Blues model is interdisciplinary, retains its interdisciplinary capacity. It looks at creativity and the body, as well as creative writing, role playing, musical improvisation, and so on. And it's also integrative in that it draws on behavioral thinking and CBT, in humanistic psychotherapy, and psychodynamic ideas, and more contemporary narrative and postmodern ideas. And it has it's goal-based, and it has 8 ingredients. I'm going to take you through some of these ingredients, and we'll discuss with them very briefly, with raise questions of how this may be relevant for postnatal depression. So the first set of ingredients is about encouraging active engagement and learning skills. So there is an encouragement for participants in a group, which is where the Art for the Blues normally takes place, will do something. So it's very much about engaging, gentle physical warm-up, visual warm-up. Might be that people learn how to do body scans or mindful movement, breathing exercises to manage anxiety and stress, in order to become familiar with the media in order to be able to begin the work, really. Emma?
Oh, yes, sorry. So, yes, I think the most important thing in terms of working with perinatal mental health generally, and working with mothers and babies, is the question of the presence of the baby. Is the baby going to attend the therapy with the mother? That's not always possible with therapies in NHS services, but if not, who's going to provide the childcare? So it's a huge decision to be made, and it's one that in our study that we have that we've designed it so that babies can be present. And if baby is present, then a large part of the learning skills is that ability to model positive attachments between mother and baby. And fostering healthy bonds has been shown to have a positive impact on maternal mental health. So I think that's quite key early on in those learning skills.
The second set of key ingredients for the model is about building strengths. We're very interested in resourcing and enabling people to be strong enough to be able to look at distress and address challenges. And we believe that developing relationships is an important prerequisite to feel safe enough and be supported enough to look at things that are more difficult and be able to express emotions safely. And Leah talked about, is it safe to talk about how I'm feeling? Leah, that's relevant not only for women, but generally people who are struggling. So within the model of the Art of the Blues, we're thinking about encouraging people to engage in mirroring exercises, witnessing in a non-judgmental way, changing leadership structures, so have a democratic opportunity to share things around group drawings, symbolic movement communication, and so on. So these are some examples you see on the slide of how developing relationships and expressing emotions can be encouraged within the model.
Yes, and in terms of developing relationships, of course, if we keep in mind that the healthy attachment bonds between mother and baby are going to have a positive impact on maternal mood, a large part of developing those relationships within intervention, within this client group, perinatal health, should be focused on that mother-baby relationship. And again, Vicky has said this in terms of expressing emotion. It's really important to note that allowing that permission to discuss those emotions openly is very important, and creating a safe and supportive space where emotions can be freely expressed is particularly important.
With this as prerequisite, thinking about group becomes ready to address challenges, and it may become ready to address challenges, but that's the sort of the aim for us. And if this is the case, then there would be an encouragement to process things at a deeper level. We know that depression, for example, is often associated with internalized anger. Emma talked about guilt in the particular case. So being able to tap in and what has been, turned inwards becomes an important process. Sometimes through non-verbal communication, this can continue. Participants can continue processing things at a deeper level without needing to verbalize it, which makes it safer and may allow people to gain an understanding of what's happening. Again, whether they verbalize it or not. Active imagination, movement metaphors, reflecting on one's work and receiving feedback are some of the things that we expect to be encouraging at this stage in a group.
Yes, and I think it has been said when processing at a deeper level, that I think there is the chance that we have to be mindful of that some of the triggers for the symptoms of postnatal depression can be quite specific to the childbirth, and storytelling, of course, can be an important process, as we've talked about a lot tonight, in which the stories of childbirth find some. I've written find a voice, but actually, as Vicky said, that doesn't necessarily have to be verbalized. Find some kind of narrative, become real in some way in the body, perhaps verbally, for that trauma that childbirth can sometimes be.
As a way of closing the group, and the art and creativity offer great opportunities for experimentation that I guess linear thinking, verbal psychotherapy doesn't always lend itself to it, depending on the level of creativity that is used within psychotherapy, I guess. But an opportunity to experiment with different ways of being is an important ingredient next to being able to integrate things, integrate useful insights, useful material, useful things that are learned from the process of therapy, and taking that outside the group and outside the therapeutic environment. So improvisation, role-playing, creating movement, visual or poetic summaries of therapeutic journey, and being able to engage with regular arts making outside the group, potential things that people can be left with towards the end of the group and after the group has finished.
And I think with mothers and babies, I think it's in particular that mothers may now feel that they have a new identity as a mother. And part of that integrating of the material is exploring their own motherhood in relationship with their baby as well. I think that's quite a key difference or an addition to that ingredient of that closure section.
So this is the model. This is how we're thinking of integrating, for adapting it for the Emma's project. We're in collaboration and with the Women's Hospital to see. We have an agreement, Emma, if I'm not mistaken, that we are going to deliver this project there. We're in the process of ethical approval at the moment. Emma has been successful in submitting it only on Friday. It's very exciting because it's lengthy, and because NHS is involved, we're going to expect a lengthy NHS ethical approval as well. We're hoping that we'll collect stories, we'll collect evidence, we'll be able to have direct impact on the women who are participating in this program. We're also expecting that we'll make a contribution potentially towards policy making.